Chapter 4. All of a sudden, chapter 4 seems to go in another direction. It's really not. But if you've read New already and read over chapter 4, by the way, one thing you're going to want to do before you come to class, read over the chapters. We're going to discuss that, and it'll help you out a lot. Okay? And make sure when you get the book, read over the new stuff. It sounds like I'm talking about cows, but I'm not. It's really the author's name. Anyway, yeah, read the moose stuff doesn't sound right. It sounds like I'm talking about milk or something, or whatever. Anyway, what I was going to say is, we get to chapter 4. And all of a sudden in chapter 4, we're talking about Abraham. Okay? Any idea why we're talking about Abraham in chapter 4, and what in the world is Paul doing here?
I would probably say he has to show them that there was somebody else who was righteous by faith.
Yeah. That it's always been salvation by faith for the Jews.
Right.
And that kind of gets to the one topic question here is, how was Abraham saved, and what is the method of salvation always the same? What do you think? Were we always saved the same way as the Jews were back then?
No.
Hmm? No? Okay, what's different?
Well,
I think so.
Yes? We can take all answers for now. What's different first off? Then we'll get to why it's the same.
well, Abraham considered to be perfect in their Jews' eyes. So, I don't know. So I guess they tried to live their lives after Abraham's model, I guess.
Right.
So they didn't have Jesus at the time to live their life after, so they would look to Abraham.
Let me go to you for your answer. Then I'll try to answer both of them.
I think it's similar, salvation, same, just because we're both saved by faith.
Okay.
It's just a different, we believe, we have faith and we believed on what Jesus did,
Right.
even though we didn't see it.
Right.
And they believed and had faith of the Messiah to come, even though they didn't see it.
Essentially the right answer. Here's what I would say. We are both saved by faith, by belief in the Messiah.
Right.
There's never been a person in history that's been saved by any other method. The Jews were saved by looking forward to the Messiah, the promise to come. We're saved by looking backwards on the Messiah.
Right.
And there were some practical ramifications too to that. Think about this. When a Jew died who was a saved Jew in the Old Testament, and by the way, also, I do believe that Israel, saved Israel, and the church are two distinct entities. They're not the same thing. Israel never became the church. We've never become spiritual Israel or anything else. We'll get into that later. But the point being is that I believe that the promises to Israel will still be fulfilled in the future in a millennial kingdom. But the point being is this. We didn't become Israel or something like that. They look forward to the Messiah. We look backward to the Messiah. Where did a Jew who was a believer go when he died in the Old Testament? Go to heaven?
No.
Where'd he go?
To the,
I see a descending view here. You go to heaven?
no. What was that name? Is
He's
that,
positive.
yeah, because Jesus talks about it.
When the rich man Lazarus was talking to him,
Right. They could see each other.
right?
That,
Where was Lazarus at?
what was the name of that?
Two names. You remember either one? Two names for the good portion: Abraham's bosom
Abraham's bosom.
and paradise.
And paradise.
Okay.
I've never heard that was.
Here's why. Abraham's bosom and paradise are the same. They're not heaven. Okay? In the Old Testament, we had what was called Sheol. Sheol is a fancy word for the grave. Sheol can literally mean, I took a body and planted it in the ground because he died. Okay? He's in the grave. However, in many references, it's talking about the abode of the afterlife in the Old Testament. What you had is Sheol, for example, if you look at the rich man and Lazarus, Sheol was divided into two chambers: paradise and what we would call hell. Okay? Now, here's what happens. A Jew, when he died in the Old Testament, could not go straight to heaven. He had to go to paradise instead. Any idea why? This is critical. We'll get more about what in a minute. But why couldn't a Jew, when they died, just go straight to heaven in the Old Testament?
Jesus had not done his work yet.
Hadn't paid the redemption yet.
Right.
And right, essentially think of it this way. Let's say I took one of my Chase cards, Chase Sapphire card, and I pulled it out, and Chase went nuts and gave me a $40 million line of credit. They didn't, by the way, okay? And I decided, yeah, that sounds good. I'm going out and spend $40 million. First thing I'm going to do, about 12 million pizzas, and then go from there, okay? All right, I spend $40 million, I get to the end of it, and it's like Chase comes and says, Mr. Hafer, we got a problem here. You owe us $40 million. And I'm like, whatever, okay? Now, I would be in trouble. In this country, I'd have to file bankruptcy. In previous generations, I would have gone to debtor's prison, whatever, okay? However, what if my father actually had $1 billion in the bank? And he came along and he said, don't worry, Chase, I'll cover it, 40 mil, no problem, okay? Very similar to a situation with Christ paying our penalty with the ransom. However, what is the difference between me owing that money to Christ, God, or my Father on earth coming and saying, here's the $40 million and paying it off, or the difference between my Father phoning Chase and say, look, I got the $40 million, I'll pay you in 3 months.
Well,
Okay?
yeah.
What's the difference?
Well, I mean,
Just let you sit there.
The point is, what's happening is, one is a promise for something that's going to happen, the other is something that's already happened.
right.
At the point in time when a Jew died in the Old Testament, the propitiation, verse 25, had not yet occurred because the ransom hadn't been paid. So therefore, God's wrath had not been appeased. Therefore, a saved Jew could not go straight to heaven and be in God's presence because the ransom hadn't been paid yet. So because of that, even though God knew what was going to happen, he had to have some place that was a place of paradise, not punishment obviously. He had to have some place where they could go, but they couldn't go to heaven directly at that point in time yet.
So when Jesus dies on the cross,
Yes.
stops by that place,
Hmm?
Abraham's bosom,
Absolutely.
takes it up.
Remember it says, frees captivity or takes captivity
Right.
captive. He catches captivity and takes it with him.
Right.
That's talking about emptying Sheol. There is no one in paradise anymore. Paradise is empty if it exists at all. Because Christ has now paid the penalty. As soon as the penalty was paid, he had redeemed them. He could then take them and literally take them to heaven with them, and they could stand before God as sinless.
So I'm sure the people in the other side of hell,
Other
I'm sure
side
they
of
saw
hell,
it.
in my opinion, are still there.
Right, they're
In
still
addition
there.
to that, in Ephesians, he talks about preaching to those in hell. Preaching to those in Sheol. What he's preaching is not, you need to be saved. He's preaching judgment to them.
Right.
He's coming to say to them, you had your chance, you didn't take it, you are here justly and you are condemned justly. That is the preaching that they're talking about, the preaching as far as the preaching for in Sheol, okay? It's not talking about preaching for salvation or anything else. So it sounds, let me say this, you're going to get this in another class probably. You're going to get it in the book of Ephesians and several other places where it goes into detail more. I think the Petrine epistles do it as well. But anyway, you'll probably hit this in other classes, or your theology class should cover this. The point is, a Jew when they die did not go straight to heaven in the Old Testament. Every bit as guaranteed saved as we are. But the payment hadn't actually been paid yet. So you couldn't go straight to heaven.
What about Gentiles?
Well, so Gentiles in the Old Testament, unless they converted to Judaism and followed what was going on, they weren't going to heaven anyway. They went straight to hell.
Okay, so they had to convert to Judaism
In
to
the
be
Old
saved?
Testament. Yeah.
So they couldn't be Gentiles and be saved?
From what let me say this, there's some question on that. From what I can see in the Old Testament, that certainly wasn't the norm, that certainly wasn't the way it would happen, no. God chose the people. It wasn't like he chose the Jews and then revealed himself to the whole world. The Jews were supposed to bring people in, okay? Didn't happen a lot. I don't want to say there were none because you didn't have people called God-fearers that were Gentiles. So I won't say there were none. There were some. But the point is, it wasn't like it was a big Gentile church or anything back then looking for, and they weren't even a church, wrong word. But the point is, it wasn't like there was, oh, you had a group of church people in Iraq following, they weren't Jews, they were just, no. Not at that point in time. Later on, yes. Okay?
Okay.
But at that point in time, no, it was a Jewish religion.
So what's the deal with the 144,000 children?
Totally different. It's, for one thing, the Jehovah's Witnesses turned that into a cult type thing, which we're not going to go into. That's actually talking about in the tribulation period. It's talking about 12,000 of each tribe being great witnesses that will lead people to Christ. But that's in the millennial kingdom, that's in the tribulation actually, not the millennium.
I just thought that was applied to Judaism and that.
No.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with it as far as that goes. And it is for Jews, but it's not just saying, it's not going to say 144,000 saved either. It's 144,000 witnesses that are going to save multitudes, millions. But that's talking about the millennium, that's not talking about the Old Testament. Old Testament, you couldn't go straight to heaven. That's important to know, because it hadn't been. Chapter 3 just told us why.
So Gentiles had to convert to Judaism.
Or, well, they had to follow the law, they had to do sacrifice, they had to do all the things.
Do circumcision and all
Oh
that.
yeah, that circumcision was part of it.
So if you were like,
You had to be a real committed Gentile to want to.
if you had to like be, if you were 40 years old, you had to do all of that.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Women had a real advantage in that case.
Yes.
Yeah, I know.
So, in cases like King of Persia, Cyrus, when he
Cyrus, yeah.
Cyrus, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
When he confesses that
We don't
God
know.
is the God.
We don't know if that was salvation or not. We know that he was professing the existence and knowledge of God. A lot of people believe in God. Read James chapter 2:19, I think it is. Devils believe.
Okay.
The demons believe, rather. They're not saved. They know God exists. When Christ came to the demon in Gadara, they acknowledged him as God and said, please don't force us out.
Right.
Why? He said, why are you here? Your time hasn't come yet.
Mhm.
So people can believe in God without believing in Christ.
Right.
Point is, what I was going to say is, this is what we're talking about this is what we're talking about as far as the fact that in the Old Testament, the method of salvation was always the same, but it was looking forward to what was going to happen instead of backwards. And Israel and the church are two separate entities. Okay? Now, did Abraham have, no, why, let's go back to this. Why do you think Paul brought up Abraham? You mentioned it kind of.
Because he lived a so-called perfect life.
He actually didn't. If you look at Abraham's life, Abraham did a lot of things that were wrong.
Okay, so he lived a perfect life.
Well, he was righteous by faith, by believing.
That's the key there. But here's the point also. He brought up Abraham because honestly, that's the one person every Jew would say, aha, our father.
Our Father.
Right.
There's no better than Abraham.
Right. Exactly. He wasn't perfect, but they would have revered him above everyone else. Okay. Now, what I was going to say is that all of a sudden we have something new happening or revealed to us in chapter 4. So what then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh has found? Basically saying, what do you think he did through works? What do you think he did through the flesh?
Right.
Okay, he's speaking to the Jews here again. It says, for if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now the one who has works, his wage is not reckoned as a favor, but as what is due. Let me put this in terms we can comprehend easily, okay? I own a computer networking company. I have a wonderful employee that works for me full-time, a network administrator named Caleb, okay? At the end of every 2 weeks, Caleb gets a paycheck. Caleb gets to live on that money. He can spend that money. He can do whatever he wants with that money, okay? Now, what if every 2 weeks, what do you think Caleb's response would be if I say, Caleb, 2 weeks are up. I have a gift for you. What do you mean gift? I earned this. I worked 40 hours a week for this. Would it be a gift if I gave it to him because he gave me 40 hours of service each week? No, that's wages. Well, look at what verse 4 is saying. Now, the one to the one who works, his wage is not reckoned as a favor, but as what is due. So the point is, if Abraham had earned his salvation through works, his salvation would have been due to him as his earnings. It wasn't. He was saved through faith, and that's exactly what you're talking about in verse 3, where it talks about, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as salvation. Now, I'm going to teach you one Greek word here, and I hope you're going to remember it because it's one that most people don't teach you. You hear, agape, koinonia, whatever, ecclesia, etc. You might have learned those Greek words. The word I want to say to you is logizomai. In English, it would be like Logizomai. Okay? You don't have to copy it down if you want to, but here's one. Logizomai. And when it's talking about reckoning here, when it says it was reckoned to him as righteousness, that word is logizomai, or a form of it. When it talks about verse 4 about reckoning, it's logizomai. We go down to verse 8, and it's talking about blessed the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. That is, take into account is logizomai. Okay? Now, logizomai in the Greek is an accounting term. It's almost like, a number, you might hear an accountant, CPA or whatever they had, CPAs or whatever, and he's sitting there doing the books to the company back in Greece. Okay, a little different, but the point is, he would have been doing logizomai. He would have been accounting, reckoning, adding to the right accounts. This is what's being referred to with Abraham. It's an accounting term that's being talked about for how he gained his righteousness. and it wasn't through works. Why do you think the accounting term is being used here? What's being applied to who and what?
Righteousness is being applied to
Whose?
Abraham. God's righteousness.
Christ's righteousness,
Christ.
God's righteousness, exactly, is being applied, or logizomai. I know you don't add an ed to it, but here he's getting the logizomai, where it's Christ's righteousness, is being applied to Abraham's account. Now that's what makes us righteous before God. It's not our works. Because if it was our works, we'd have reason to brag. And again, when we come back to things like our relationship with God, our eternal security, and things like that, if it's truly logizomai of Christ's righteousness being applied to us, what can we do to screw up Christ's righteousness? Nothing. And what Paul's saying is this. Guys, you've always thought in terms of Jews and Gentiles. Forget that. Look, even as a Jew, you had the same exact basis of faith in the Old Testament as you do in the New Testament. No difference. Everything was always about applying God's righteousness to your account. Even though it was an IOU then instead of the actual payment. Then it was paid at the death of Christ. Same exact process, same method, same thing. Never something where there was a different method of salvation. And we frequently as Christians, you'll hear accusations of, well, you had salvation by works in the Old Testament, salvation by faith in the New Testament. No, we don't. Salvation by faith also, Paul's answering this in chapter 4 to say, look, who do you know that's better than Abraham in this whole thing? And Abraham was saved by faith. And we can see that. Now what's interesting also is, it says that it was, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Anybody know where he believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteous? Yes?
When he promised him that he will have a son.
Yes, exactly. Most people think it's when the sacrifice of Isaac came. Happened long before that. Abraham became a believer at the point in time, a concrete believer at least, at the point in time where he said, you're going to have a son, and against all reasoning.
He was very old. Sarah was...
Yeah, exactly. He was shriveled up. Sarah, if you look at the actual text, Sarah was post-ministrating. She was already, and she was laughing about it. Yeah, right, sure. Okay? So the point is, it was truly a miracle, but Abraham, instead of saying, this can't happen, is saying God will do it. He knew it as end. Now, did he grow weak in the faith with Hagar? Yes, although in truth he may have thought he was doing the right thing, because that was actually a ancient Near Eastern custom at that time.
That was a way to have.
It was, so he may have thought that. However, obviously that wasn't what God had in mind. But the point is, he was the faith was reckoned or calculated or accounted as righteousness at that point in time. It didn't come later, it didn't come... Now, in the Old Testament, one difference I will say. Old Testament, a person could lose their salvation as such. They could fall out of belief. One of the reasons I don't believe that can happen anymore is not just because the penalty's been paid and it goes away, but the other reason is simple. It's because the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we actually do become a literal new creation. Chapter 7, we talk about that. We're going to get to that in a week or two. Okay? Probably next week, I think, if I remember correctly. Anyway, what I was going to say is, with Abraham, always the same method of salvation, never different. That's the key to this whole thing here. And that's why he's going back to this. Now, in something else I was going to say is, all false religions have works as the basis of their salvation. All false religions, the person who's in it deserves to go to heaven because they've made themselves good enough to stand before God. That's not Christianity. That's why I hate to call Christianity a religion. Christianity is a relationship, not a religion.
Right.
And that's why. Now, let me see, 410. More question about how Abraham was saved. Circumcision and justification. Let me see this. I already talked about logizomai. Okay, we don't need to go there. We talked about that. Okay. Let me ask you a question here first. This brings this up. Somebody read 4:10 through 12 for us. Who's next? Who's going to read? I don't remember. Okay, go ahead.
How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as the seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well.
Now, if we start looking at that, what I was going to say is, what's that actually saying about the timetable here? About with Abraham's salvation?
Well, before he was circumcised, he was a Gentile, and he had faith in God, and then,
He became a Jew when he was circumcised?
and then he
You
was.
sure about that?
What do you mean?
Are you sure that he became a Jew when he was circumcised? Let me ask you a question, first off. Timetable is this. Faith came before circumcision in Abraham's case.
Right.
Okay,
That's what I was trying to say.
I understand that, and you're right. Quick question for you, and most people don't get this right. Was Abraham a Jew?
No.
No.
No. Who was the first Jew?
What did I say?
I would disagree.
Yeah.
Who was the first Jew?
I don't know.
Oh, Israel?
Yeah, Jacob.
Israel.
The guy named Israel. That's exactly right. Israel. Okay, so we got, yeah, actually, so that's how we talk about the first Jew. Jacob was actually the first Jew. And Jacob had the 12 sons, or all the sons which became the 12 tribes of Israel.
Okay.
Okay? Actually, some grandchildren in there also when it finally got dealt out because of different sin. But anyway, the point is, no. So here's what it's coming to. Abraham was the grandfather of the first Jew. He wasn't the first Jew.
Right.
So, number one, if you're getting this by your heritage of being a Jew, how was Abraham saved before he was even Jewish? How was he saved before he was circumcised? He couldn't have been if they had been right. If it was by works, if it was by birthright or anything like that, Abraham would have been left out in the cold.
Right.
So-
So does he believe?
Yeah, it was because of faith, exactly. And because righteousness was reckoned to him, legizomai to him, okay?
So
And-
what was your question to me then? Are you sure about that?
Oh, I thought you said when Abraham was circumcised, he became a Jew.
Yeah.
He didn't.
But he was notified.
Abraham never did become a Jew.
So that's what I was saying. I didn't know what you were asking.
Oh, sorry. Well, what I just say is this. When I asked, are you sure Abraham became a Jew when he was circumcised?
And I wasn't saying he became a Jew. I was saying that he became, through faith, he became a believer. That's what I was saying.
I would say this, according to this passage, he was a believer before he did that.
Well, he became under God or.
I would say this, he did an outward sign to show his belief at God's command.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I misunderstood. It sounded like you were saying he became a Jew then, and I'm
No.
like, nope, didn't become a Jew.
No.
Abraham never was a Jew. So, and that's something, again, most people don't think about. Now, let me ask you another question. If it is the law that saves, okay? Think back to your Old Testament chronology. You got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob or Israel, Joseph, okay?
How would they say it without?
Well, I got a question. Where did Moses fit in that group?
Where would he fit in that group?
Yeah.
In the law, you mean, or?
No, I mean that chronology. Abraham, Isaac, Israel, Joseph. Where's Moses fit in?
No.
Not Moses. Abraham was Sodom and Gomorrah. Huh?
Right, so where would he fit? in
Anybody
that group?
remember when compared to those guys, when Moses was born?
He was born 400, probably
At least 400 years
later.
afterwards, right.
Yeah.
So my question is this. What are we talking about what the law is in Romans generally? What do we call the law, the full name of it?
Moses,
The Mosaic Law.
Mosaic law.
Okay. If they are saved by the Mosaic Law, how is it that the Mosaic Law came into effect? Moses wasn't even born for 400 more years or so.
Right.
So the point is, we obviously know they were not saved by the Mosaic Law because the Mosaic Law couldn't have even existed. So obviously, Abraham was not saved by the law.
Right.
The law wasn't even there. And this is, again, what Paul's arguing about is the fact that it was never the law, it was never the circumcision, it was never anything like that that saved them as far as that goes. Okay? Let me ask you a question, opinion question. Question is circumcision in any way like baptism?
You can say so.
I was just going to ask you, do you think that if he didn't circumcise, that he would still
I think it is.
been saved?
In that case, the lack of works would have been an evidence of the lack of faith. It was always the faith that saved, but God told him to do it. So I think it would have been showing that he didn't have the faith. Now, and he had great faith. My point is, though, two things. Number one, I am grateful that baptism instead of adult circumcision is now the means of, showing we're believers. But what's the similarity or dissimilarity between baptism and circumcision?
Both you do it by obedience because that is something that God asks us to do, as to show our faith in Him.
With Abraham, that's true. With later generations of Jews, it was not true. They were circumcised on the 8th day. Remember Paul, when he's bragging about, I was Pharisee of the Pharisees, circumcised on the 8th day, etc. So in truth, I would be very hesitant to start. A lot of times people will link baptism and circumcision.
Yeah, but in our society, baptism is part of, I guess, a church culture. And
Shouldn't be, but you're right. A lot of people do practice it that way.
And it's not essential to salvation.
I would say this. Baptism, as it's practiced in a lot of churches like Lutheran, Catholic, etc. Okay, infant baptism, very young, has a lot of similarities to circumcision. But I don't believe infant baptism is appropriate for a believer. I was baptized as an infant. I didn't have any choice. But I've grown up and realized and got rebaptized as a believer because of that, okay? So I think, again, the reason I bring it up is some people see baptism and circumcision like this as, both the same symbols. No, it is a certain type. We don't do that same thing anymore. Now, you could make a comparison to Abraham being circumcised because it was as a believer and a choice. Again, much easier to be dunked in water. But the point is that, I don't think it's a fair comparison in most cases.
I don't think it is.
Yeah. All right. One thing I got to bring out here, and it says, we talked about it we talked about Abraham being the father of all who believe without being circumcised. So before he was circumcised, he was the father of all who believe. This is where many people will justify things like we call covenant theology. Covenant theology says that the church became spiritual Israel, and the church and Israel are the same thing, and that the promises to Israel are actually being fulfilled spiritually in the church. Okay? One of the problems you have when you take that belief is that frequently it also means if the church has become Israel, we are still bound to the laws of Israel also. Bound to the Mosaic law, which I disagree with. Okay? But we need to be aware of this because right off the bat, isn't this saying he's the father of all who believe? Doesn't that mean the church is part of Israel and been grafted into Israel and things like that?
That's the way you interpret it.
If you interpret it that way. Is that appropriate? Is there another way to interpret it?
Just that section of it right there?
Yeah, those verses that we're talking about, verse 11 and verse 12.
The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised.
And many people believe that means that, that the church and Israel are the same
But
thing.
he was the father of all who believed before he was circumcised, and then also to those who
Father of the
were,
Jews, right.
I
Right.
think
So,
that gives. I'm
it-
sorry.
That's okay.
But I think that what he's saying is that there's some sort of historical reference there.
Well, let me throw something else at you. I think is a good way to explain it, okay? I frequently heard George Washington called the father of our country. Does that mean that our country was the example of becoming an American, or does that mean he was extremely promiscuous and we're all his biological children? First one. I think we got to go with that one, okay? The point being is we have the same thing here in that Abraham was showing the way of the belief prior to being circumcised. And that basically what this means in this case is Abraham was the first believer in this method at that point in time. But again, what that's not talking about is it's not talking about a biological relationship. It's not talking about the church being grafted into Israel or something like that. It's talking about
an example to follow.
Yeah, because look at the whole context.
Yeah.
The whole context is, here is the method of salvation. It's never changed.
Right.
To inject into it that this is the church being grafted into Israel would actually be putting a new topic into it almost. Whereas instead, if you're just looking and saying, hey, you see, Abraham, when he was saved by faith before circumcision, was still, the way to do it and everything else, that makes sense. To me, I think that's a much better way of interpreting this chapter. And the reason I bring it up is because I think it's not that covenant theology people are going to end up in hell or anything like that, okay? But there are major differences in how you live your Christian life based on whether you're covenant theology or not. And we're going to see that especially in relationship to the law as we hit chapters 6, 7, and places like that. I'm kind of laying the groundwork now for what we're going to hit in a week or two. But that's why I'm bringing up covenant theology as far as that goes. Okay? But again, George Washington, no, father of his country does not mean that as far as that goes. One other question I have regarding who was the first Jew. If Abraham would have been the first Jew, what would that mean about Ishmael?
He should have been a Jew too.
He would have been a Jew too, wouldn't he?
Mm-hmm.
He's not.
No.
Isaac was a Jew.
Right.
Ishmael was not. All of the children of Israel were Jews. Not all the children of Isaac were Jews, because Esau was not a Jew. Esau had the Edomites who came out of Esau. And the point is that if you remember, there's one spot where God actually told the Israelites, do not go kill the Edomites because they're your cousins, or something like that. They were not Jews, but they were the son of Isaac. So we can prove Isaac and Abraham were not Jews.
Right.
On the other hand, all descendants of Jacob or Israel are Jews. And that's also the reason why he changed his name as well. He was literally the first of the Jews. Okay. Now, 14 and 15, talking about the fruits of the law. Actually, I may skip over this just for time. We'll see. It was promised to Abraham, he said, not through the law. Okay, we pretty much covered that. If the law brings about wrath. Oh yeah, no, this we do need to cover. Okay, we hit this last week some. What is the purpose of the law? It says 15, for the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation.
I think the purpose of the law is to show us or identify what is sin, so that going forward we can say this is sin.
To condemn.
Right, condemn this.
Right. As I said last week, how many times have you been pulled over by the police, hauled into court, and the police says, man, this guy was driving beautifully. And the judge says, thank you for coming in here, sir. We love you. You're a wonderful driver. That is not what happens. That's not why the police pull you over. That is not what the court says. Okay? Yet, many people want to be saved through the law. The law was never intended to save anyone.
Made to condemn.
Right, it's made to condemn. Now, number two, what does it say if there's no law, there's no violation? What's it talking about?
How can you violate something if no sin is?
Yeah. No, but if there's no law, how can you violate what doesn't exist? The reason it's illegal to do 120 miles an hour on Good Luck Road is because there's signs there saying 35 miles an hour, 30 down on the other part of it, okay? It's not because, if those signs weren't there, well, technically there's probably other laws in Maryland against 120, but the point is, those signs on the road that we see with the big numbers on them, those define what's legal and not legal, okay? The signs that say left turn only, that usually the people, like when on my way here, the guy that was in the left turn only lane, the left turn only lane, and decided he didn't want to go left, so he swerved in front of me on the way here. He violated the law. Had there been no law to say left turn only, it wouldn't have been a violation. As it was, he was a violator and stupid. He gets both. He gets the award. Now, I think I was going to say Good Luck Road again. You do 120 on Good Luck Road, you may well die, but it's not because you violated the law if there's no law against it. You may well be stupid too, but it's still not against the law. And here's where it's saying here, if there's no law, there's no violation. One thing to consider here that Paul will get to in a little bit also, think about this. He says something later on about sin increasing under the law. Any ideas what he might be talking about?
Sin increasing
Under the law. Yeah. Any idea what that might mean? We'll hit it again later, but...
Well, I think that, I don't know, is it because now they know what sin is?
It's part of it. Also because there's a lot more rules to follow. There was nothing wrong with eating a lobster prior to the Mosaic Law. After the Mosaic Law, there was. Nothing wrong. It was with a pig. A pig you could get trichinosis from. However, it wasn't against the law, the Mosaic Law, to eat a pig.
Right.
Once you got the Mosaic Law, it was. And that's just the beginning of the list. I mean, there was a law for everything under the sun. I mean, if you ever, I said, take some time to look at the laws in the first, or in the early books of the Bible.
Is there a class that goes over all of that?
The laws?
The laws would probably the
Actually, you mean in the Bible College?
yeah.
I actually taught a class, I don't know if it still exists anymore, I actually taught earlier in the last year a class called Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible. We hit all of that stuff. And wonderful class, we had a great time in that. Today, I also taught creation and fall after that, which is technically a theology course, not a, we covered a little bit,
But I would love to
all there.
understand all the different reasons
Yeah.
for all those laws.
Yeah, well, for one thing, okay, we don't go into every one of them, but honestly, what I found in many cases is a lot of laws are practical. don't eat bugs, don't eat pigs, trichinosis.
So it's like a
Don't-
nanny state.
Hmm?
Nanny state.
Yeah, a little bit, except here's the difference. If God sets the rules, I'll follow them.
But
If
it was-
Bloomberg sets them because he doesn't want anybody to have 16-ounce sodas that are bigger, I got a problem with
But
it
was
up
it
in New
like,
York.
was it like the men were setting the laws, or was it God setting the laws?
God set these laws for Israel. Now, there was also, in addition to that, they wrote their own set of laws, which was volume after volume after volume that was ridiculous.
That's what I'm saying.
That was the men.
The nanny state.
Right, that was the nanny state, that was the men doing that. Because there was literally, one of the things, those little tricks they'd have is, on the Sabbath, they decided to define what was work and not. God just said, don't work on the Sabbath in the Old Testament,
Oh,
okay?
yeah.
They decided we need to define what work is. And work became, you can't be more than so many feet, or not feet, but whatever their measurement was back then. You can't be so many, rods or so from your home or whatever, from your property.
Right.
So you know what the Pharisees started doing in Jerusalem? They go around Jerusalem, all over the city, buying pieces of property like this all over the city. So wherever they went, they'd still be within that distance and therefore following the law, and they could do whatever they wanted to. It was following the letter of the law that they had created themselves. It was never following the intent of God's law.
Sounds like our government.
It does, exactly. I know, I agree. Yeah, so it's a stupid thing, but that's what a lot of the Pharisees were doing. And they had different laws, different ways of doing it, stuff like that. But most of that was man-made. But let's not forget, there was a lot of the law in the Old Testament in the first 5 books that really was, God said, don't eat a pig. I love bacon, I love ham, I love pork, but I wouldn't have eaten it back then. And it would have been a practical thing because trichinosis, tapeworm. So there was a lot of things like that that if you look at the laws, it actually made sense. The civil laws also, if you kill a person, here are the options. If you kill a person's animal by mistake, here are the options. It's like that whole thing just spelling out one after another, okay? So, again, it's not that the law was bad, but when the law increases, the number of laws increase, and you speak about our government, it's gotten to the point where there's been some studies done recently where they estimate that every person breaks the law minimum 3 times a day. And not only that, it was like at least a couple times a week we're committing felonies and don't know it. It's that bad, because there's so many laws we don't know. It's insane the number of laws that we have sometimes. And you literally, I've talked to policemen also, they've said if they want to pull you over and charge you with something, they can. You cannot drive perfectly enough to not be pulled over if they want to pull you over. And that was policemen telling me that. I mean, friends that I had who were policemen and stuff like that. Doesn't mean they do, but the fact is, the more laws that you have, the more violations there are. And that's what it's talking about here. If there's no law, there's no violation. Okay. Back to the faith of Abraham. Just going over it again, that it's going to be by faith, period. But in addition to that, let me see. The point of this whole verse was to show that faith is different from the law. That's what it's going over through this section here. And let me see. No, we already just covered that. Hang on a second. Covering a bunch of stuff without even looking at my notes, which is good. No, I don't need to bring that up. That's not going to be. Okay. 4:18. In hope against hope he believed, talking about Abraham, in order they might become the father of many nations. What's he talking about when he says in hope against hope?
Hope.
And hope against hope. Does that make a lot of sense to you?
Yeah.
And not only that, I'm looking at the original here. They are both based on elpis, which is the word for hope, elpida here. And what it could say is same word. It's not like an English mix-up or something like that. It literally says hope against hope. Elpida, elpida. So, not, yeah. Anyway, point is hope against hope. What's it talking about? Any idea?
It's talking about how God had given hope to have a son when they used to think there's no way I'm gonna have a son.
Hope against hope means believing when there's no logical reason to believe.
Oh.
Absolutely. There's just no reason to believe. It's fine. One thing I will say this, when I went to seminary, I knew I had to go to seminary. I told you guys before, I took 27 years to graduate from college. Not even grad school, but college, okay? Founded a business in the middle of it and things like that, and I took, years and years and years to do it. When God told me to go back and finish, I had 90 credits. When he told me to go back and finish, I immediately went back and finished and immediately went to grad school and did the degree as fast as it can possibly be done, okay? I knew from a number of reasons and for what I felt God was telling me that I had to do this immediately. I had no clue as to why. Most guys go, I'll get my Master of Divinity and I want to go be a senior pastor somewhere. Nope. Didn't want to be a senior pastor. If God calls me to it, that's fine. That wasn't my desire. I don't want to be assistant pastor. I don't know, maybe someday, but that's not why I went or anything else. I had no clue as to why I went, but I knew God wanted me to go. I knew this. I knew I loved teaching, but I never thought I could actually get into a teaching position. As it worked out, a number of things happened. It was like, bang, it happened. And it's wonderful. But the point is that I would say in that case, it was belief in God and hope against hope. So I really, not only that, I had no reason to believe that running a business, I could actually finish seminary at the same time and everything. Did. And again, hope against hope. Now, Abraham was even more because he had to leave his country and everything else. But in that case, it's just a small example. Again, hope against hope. In this case, from Genesis 18, we can see Sarah had ceased to ovulate. Well, if you're not ovulating, pretty much that's saying, in that time period there, you're not having a kid. Somehow they had a kid. That was obvious that God did it. And not only that, but he also glorified God while he was waiting on God. Hope against hope, it doesn't mean he sat there saying, the whole time, oh man, I bet God won't do well. Maybe he will. Maybe no. He actually glorified and rejoiced in what God was going to do. He believed it. Okay. Why was Abraham positive that God would do what he said?
Why was what?
Why was Abraham positive that he would do what he said? Why was Abraham positive that God would do what he said? It's not a big question. I'm just curious what you think on that.
Could have been because he had already been faithful to him in the past.
I think that's part of it. And not only that, but what it comes down to is Abraham's faith. For whatever reason, God had proven it to him, and it was Abraham's faith. There was nothing to make him believe that Sarah could get pregnant again. Yet it happened as far as that goes.